The train roared through the night like a restless thought that refused to settle, its windows flickering with passing lights, its metal body humming with quiet stories no one ever fully heard. In the far corner of a dimly lit compartment, she sat in a silk dress that did not belong to the world she was traveling through, her head slowly tilting to the side as exhaustion claimed her without permission. She had tried to stay awake, had tried to keep her posture straight, her dignity intact, but life had taken too much from her that day. And so she fell asleep, vulnerable, alone, and completely unaware of how much she was about to trust a stranger. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the quiet goodness that still exists in this world, take a moment right now to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can reach hearts that need them. Her name was Amina, and the silk dress she wore was not just fabric, it was a memory of a life that once made sense, a life where she didn't have to calculate every step, where she didn't carry fear like a second skin. That dress had been bought years ago for a celebration, one that promised a future she never got to live. Now it clung to her like a ghost of who she used to be, slightly wrinkled, slightly worn, but still holding on to a quiet elegance. That evening had broken her in ways she hadn't expected. She had attended a wedding she was never meant to attend alone. It had been her younger cousin's wedding, a loud, vibrant gathering full of laughter and music. But for Amina, every smile felt like a reminder of something missing. She had once stood where the bride stood, had once believed in a forever that slipped through her fingers like sand. The whispers, the sidewise glances, the unspoken pity, it all weighed on her more than the long journey back home. She boarded the train late, barely making it before the doors shut. There were not many people in her compartment, just a few scattered passengers, each lost in their own world. Among them sat a man named Saad, dressed simply, his presence quiet and almost invisible. He had boarded earlier, carrying nothing but a worn backpack and a face that carried its own stories. Saad noticed her the moment she entered, not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't. There was something fragile about the way she held herself together, like a glass that hadn't shattered yet but had been cracked too many times. He saw the silk dress, the tired eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she sat down, and then, slowly, he watched her surrender to sleep. At first, he looked away. It wasn't his place to watch, to assume, to care. Life had taught him that people came with complications, with stories that were not his to fix. But every time the train jolted slightly, her head would shift uncomfortably, her posture growing more vulnerable, more exposed. Her bag rested loosely beside her, her phone slipping dangerously close to the edge of the seat. The world was not always kind to people who looked like they had something to lose. Minutes turned into an hour, and Saad found himself unable to ignore the quiet responsibility that had settled on his shoulders. It wasn't something he had chosen, it was something that had chosen him. He adjusted his seat slightly, positioning himself closer, not intruding, but present. When her phone finally slipped and almost fell, he caught it just in time, placing it carefully back into her bag. He told himself it was nothing, just a simple act, but deep down he knew it was more than that. The train sped through small towns and empty stations, the kind where no one got on or off. Outside, the night deepened, wrapping everything in a thick silence. Inside, Amina remained asleep, her breathing steady, her face finally at peace in a way it hadn't been all evening. He noticed the faint tear marks on her cheeks, the kind that only came from crying when no one was watching. He didn't know her story, but he understood pain when he saw it. He had lived enough of it himself. At one stop, a group of loud passengers entered the compartment, their laughter sharp and careless. Saad felt a quiet tension rise within him as their eyes briefly lingered on Amina. He shifted slightly, his presence becoming more deliberate, a silent barrier between her and anything that might disturb her fragile rest. He didn't speak, didn't confront, but something in the way he carried himself was enough. The laughter softened, the glances disappeared. Sometimes protection didn't need words. As the journey continued, Saad kept checking the small display above the door, counting the stations. He didn't know where she was getting off, didn't know if she would wake up in time, but something told him she wouldn't, not with the kind of exhaustion she carried. And he couldn't just let her miss her stop, because sometimes life changes not in grand gestures, but in quiet decisions made in moments no one else notices.
The deeper the night grew, the quieter the train became, until it felt less like a machine and more like a drifting thought suspended between destinations. The rhythmic clatter of the tracks softened into something almost hypnotic, and most passengers had either fallen asleep or retreated into their own silence. But Saad remained awake, his eyes occasionally moving toward Amina, as if ensuring that reality hadn't shifted when he wasn't looking. There was something about her presence that unsettled him, not in a negative way, but in the way a forgotten memory suddenly resurfaces and refuses to leave. He couldn't explain it. He didn't know her name, her past, or her destination, yet he felt connected to her situation in a way that was both unfamiliar and deeply human. He had once known what it meant to be lost in plain sight. Years ago, Saad had been the one people overlooked, a man struggling quietly, carrying responsibilities no one saw, trying to build something out of nothing. There had been nights when he had wished for a stranger's kindness, just one moment where someone noticed without asking questions. But those moments never came for him. He had learned to survive without them. And yet, here he was now, being that moment for someone else. The train slowed slightly as it approached another station. A flicker of light passed across Amina's face, but she didn't wake. Her hand shifted slightly, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress, as if holding on to something even in her dreams. Saad glanced at the station name as it passed by. It wasn't the last stop, but it wasn't far from it either. A quiet concern settled in his chest. If she didn't wake up soon, she would miss wherever she was meant to go. And the last stop at this hour, it wasn't the kind of place someone like her should end up alone. He hesitated. It wasn't his place to interfere. Waking her would mean crossing an invisible boundary, but not waking her felt worse. It felt like abandoning something important. So he waited a little longer. Time stretched. The train moved forward. The decision grew heavier. Finally, as the announcement for the next station echoed faintly through the compartment, Saad leaned slightly forward, his voice low and careful, not wanting to startle her. He called out gently, not loudly, just enough to reach her without breaking the fragile calm around them. Amina stirred. At first it was subtle, a small shift, a breath that changed rhythm. Then her eyes opened suddenly, confusion flooding her expression as reality rushed back all at once. For a moment she didn't recognize where she was. The moving train, the dim lights, the unfamiliar faces, it all hit her at once. Panic flickered across her face. She sat up quickly, her eyes darting around until they landed on Saad. There was no fear in his expression, no intrusion, just a quiet reassurance. He gestured slightly toward the window, toward the slowing train, toward the moment she was about to miss. Understanding came in fragments. She looked outside, then back at him, then at the station sign coming into view. Relief washed over her so quickly it almost looked like pain. She had nearly missed it. There were no long exchanges, no dramatic words, just a simple, unspoken acknowledgement, the kind that passes between strangers who share a moment that doesn't need explanation. As the train came to a stop, Amina gathered her belongings in a rush, still disoriented but aware of how close she had come to being lost in the night. She stepped toward the door, then paused for just a second, looking back. Saad gave a small nod. Not a goodbye, not a question, just a quiet confirmation that everything was okay. But as she stepped off the train, something unexpected happened. She realized she didn't feel safe. The station was nearly empty. The lights flickered. The silence felt different here, heavier, uncertain. And suddenly the confidence she had regained moments ago began to slip again. Back inside the train, Saad watched her through the window. And in that moment, he understood something clearly. This wasn't where his responsibility ended.
Saad didn't think for long. Some decisions don't come from logic. They come from something deeper, something instinctive. As the train doors began to close, he stood up, grabbed his bag, and stepped off onto the platform, leaving behind his own destination without hesitation. The train pulled away, its lights fading into the distance, leaving the station wrapped in a quiet stillness that felt almost unreal. Amina turned, surprised to see him there. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them carried 1,000 unspoken questions, but also an unshakable sense of understanding. He hadn't followed her out of curiosity. He hadn't stepped off for any reason that needed explanation. He was simply making sure she got home safe. The walk from the station wasn't long, but at that hour it felt longer. The streets were dim, the world quieter than usual. Amina led the way, still slightly unsure, while Saad walked a few steps behind. Not too close, not too distant, just enough to be there. Step by step, the tension eased. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was steady, grounding, almost protective in its own way. For the first time that night, Amina didn't feel alone. When they finally reached her street, she slowed down. The houses were familiar now, the environment safer, warmer. She stopped near her gate, turning back toward him. This was where the moment ended. But some moments don't end the way you expect them to. Amina looked at him, really looked this time, not as a stranger on a train, but as someone who had quietly stepped into one of her most vulnerable moments and made it safe. There are people who come into your life with noise, with promises, with grand gestures that fade over time. And then there are people who arrive silently, do something meaningful, and leave without asking for anything in return. Saad was one of those people. If this story touched your heart even a little, take a moment to like, comment, and share it with someone who still believes that goodness exists in this world. And before this story ends, tell me in the comments, have you ever experienced kindness from a stranger that you never forgot? Amina didn't have the right words. Some gratitude is too big for language, so she simply nodded, her eyes carrying everything she couldn't say. Saad nodded back, and then he turned, walking away into the quiet night, disappearing just as simply as he had appeared. No names exchanged, no promises made, but something had changed. That night didn't fix everything in Amina's life. It didn't erase her pain or rewrite her past, but it gave her something she didn't realize she needed. A reminder that even in the loneliest moments, kindness can find you. And sometimes, that's enough to begin again.